Hi everyone! Today I'm going to show you how I drew this realistic red apple using colored pencils. Here you can see me getting started creating an outline using my Polychromos Middle Cadmium Red. I used a combination of Prismacolor and Polychromos to draw this apple on Legion Rising Museum mount board, which is one of my favorite papers to draw on. I'm using white Prismacolor and Polychromos pencils to block in where I want my shadows and details to go. I use the soft white Prismacolor where I want the soft highlights, and I use the white Polychromos where I want to add bright white details. So I'm indenting the paper with that pencil so that some of the bright white details will show up when I add my next layers of pencil. Now I'm using one of my dark red pencils to block in the shadow areas of the apple. I was using Tuscan red from Prismacolor and then that middle cadmium red from Polychromos. Those were my two darkest reds that I was using. And then Prismacolor 924 and 925 for the more mid-tone reds. And then for the brightest reds, I was using the Prismacolor 923 and also a deep scarlet red from Polychromos. Once I have the darkest shadow areas established, then I can just work over those areas with the more mid-tone reds. And as I move along, I'm going to be working back and forth across the shadows and midtones and trying to make sure I have a nice transition between that shadow and the mid-tone areas of the apple. But I do want to make sure I establish those nice dark shadows because that's going to give shape to the apple and make this look more 3D and more realistic. This is a layering process, as you can see, and with each layer of pencils, hopefully this apple gets closer to where I want it to be. All of the little bright white details that you can see showing up in the apple at this point are where I indented the paper with that white Polychromos pencil. And now I'm coming through and blending with a solvent. I'm using Utrecht Nude Odorless Paint Thinner, and I'm blending that with a Dynasty No. 4 flat brush. Just a really inexpensive watercolor brush. It's got pretty stiff bristles so that I can really get in there and dissolve the pigment nicely and blend everything together. And as you can see, this is really coming together and makes this apple look more painterly. Gets rid of any of the graininess you would associate with the pencil. And after the solvent dries, I can come over with my second layers of pencil. And a lot of times I'll just follow the same process or pattern that I used initially. I'll come through and darken the shadows if they're needing to be darkened. And then I just work my way through the other pencils. Just adding layer after layer. Working into that highlight. It's important to keep in mind that a highlight needs to have some detail in it as well. You don't want that to just be one solid bright white area. You need to work some of the mid-tone colors into that highlight and make sure that it transitions nicely into the rest of the apple. Want it to be nice and bright but natural looking. Here I'm using my electric eraser to go back over some of those indentations that I made initially and brighten them back up. And then I can come over with my white pencil and work straight into those little divots and fill them back in. And then I have those nice bright details on the apple. And now just adding some finishing touches. A little bit of green around the center. Now I'm moving on to the stem. And stems are really fun for me to draw. You'll see me just indenting the paper a lot using the ivory and white polychromos pencil. Then I just come through with a dark brown to go over everything and add in some shadows. And I can pretty quickly create a stem that looks very detailed and realistic using that process, using that indenting process. And then just adding some dots and dashes to add some extra details. Brightening things back up with my white pencil. And now I'm moving on to the leaves. Getting everything outlined. I've got a chrome green opaque from Polychromos, also an earth green yellowish and permanent green olive. And now using that same ivory Polychromos pencil and a white Polychromos pencil to once again use that indenting technique to create some veins in the leaves here. I'm pressing really hard with that pencil. And I'm just going to create a resist so that the second layers of pencil don't stick in those areas, and you're going to see all these veins really just pop out. And once again, it's a really easy way to create some nice detail. You can add as much detail using this process as you want. I also like to add just some little dots and divots all over the leaves. I think that it makes the leaves ultimately look a lot more natural. And now I'm working in the shadow areas. That's a 90% cool gray from Prismacolor. And just in the shadows. And now coming through with some May green and earth green yellowish in the lightest areas. And now I'm working on the mid-tone areas using a kelp green from Prismacolor. And once I get to this point, I can start to work into the shadow areas. When I add that 90% cool gray in the shadows, I don't want the leaves ultimately to look gray, but I do need something to darken up my kelp. So I want the kelp green to be the color of the leaves, but I need it to be a darker value. So I put that on top of the 90% cool gray, and that gives me a lot of contrast in the leaves. I find that in a lot of cases I don't have colors dark enough for my shadows, particularly for the greens and the leaves. So my sets don't come with a green quite this dark. And so I like to add in the cool gray underneath to give me that dark value that I'm looking for. But you can see how the veins are really just popping off the paper where I use that indentation technique. And they're a little bit too sharp for my taste, a little bit too much contrast going on. So you're going to see me come over with the solvent. When I blend all of this out, it's going to tone those down some. So they're not going to be quite so sharp, not quite so much detail in those veins. And if you want to use this technique and you want everything to stay really nice and sharp like this, you can work around the veins. You don't have to blend over them with the solvent, but I think toning them down really makes it look a lot more realistic. And so here you'll be able to see that process, and I think you can see how it starts to look more natural. You can still see the veins underneath there, but they're just not quite as sharp, not quite as contrasted. And then of course the solvent also dissolves the pigment. And again, that's the Utrecht Nude Odorless Mineral Spirits, or odorless paint thinner. You can use paint thinner, mineral spirits, any kind of solvent like that works well. I've used Gamsol quite a bit in the past. Whatever you can find. The Utrecht Nude Odorless Paint Thinner is just my go-to. I have a lot of it. A small bottle of the paint thinner lasts a long time. And now I'm just putting the finishing details on the leaves, and again, just like the apple, I'll follow the similar process. I'll come through and darken the shadows where necessary, then the highlights and midtones. Softening everything up with a really stiff bristled brush. That's a scrubber brush. And then putting the final details on the piece. And here is my completed drawing. If you would like to learn how to draw this yourself, I have created a real-time tutorial over on Patreon that you can check out if you're interested. There's a link in the description. Otherwise, I will see you for the next video here on YouTube. Bye, everybody.